Hello, I'm popping into your Facebook stream today to talk about the idea of being an introvert versus being an extrovert. Of all the personality characteristics that people are familiar with, the one that most people know about themselves is whether they're an introvert or an extrovert. If you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs, for example, you are familiar with these characteristics that people talk about. Myers-Briggs, when you take the test, it separates you based on characteristics into one of 16 boxes. And I'm not a huge fan of Myers-Briggs for that reason, because I think that you are more than a little box. So what I teach with my clients instead is the idea that personality characteristics exist on a spectrum. Okay, I'm an engineer, so I kind of think of it like a number line. And I think that's especially true with introversion, extroversion, because if you think about your own self, I bet you act differently in different situations. I bet there are some situations where you're more introverted and some situations you're more extroverted. And when I think about this in particular, I think about my son Jason's little friend Adam, his little kindergarten friend Adam, who was super, he was like an extrovert or an introvert's introvert. He was super quiet and shy. And I met his mom one day at one of the volunteer events, and I was telling her how much I loved Adam and how it would be so great if he would just come out of his shell and be more involved and speak up. And she laughed and laughed and laughed and told me that that was the last thing I wanted, that I really actually wanted to keep Adam in his shell for as long as possible, because once he got comfortable in a situation, he was just a wild man. So maybe that's an extreme example, but I imagine that you can think of yourself in different situations and know that you are more or less introverted. And the other reason that I think that that's bad, not just that we're more than one thing, but that when we think about ourselves as one thing, especially in American culture as an introvert, it limits our options and ultimately gives us less control. Like, it puts the control of how we are in situations outside ourselves. Like, oh, I'm just not comfortable in big groups. Thus, anytime I'm in a big group, I'm going to be super quiet. Okay, we're putting control of how we are in that group to something outside of ourselves. And inherently, as a coach, I just think that the more you have control over your actions, the more that you're going to get the results that you want. So I'd like to take a minute today and talk about what is different, like what science has to say about what's different for an introvert versus an extrovert. And what is different for introverts is that their brains reward them less for taking social risks. So when an introvert takes a social risk, they get less dopamine than when an extrovert takes a social risk. Okay, same situation, less dopamine. So if you think about the idea of a social risk, like asking someone to lunch, or public speaking is a social risk. If you think of that kind of in terms of a dare, like a dare your brain is giving you, and dopamine as the reward for the dare, or like money, let me show you how that plays out. So an introvert and an extrovert both get a chance to do a presentation in a big meeting. And an introvert's brain is going to reward him with $5. And an extrovert's brain is going to reward him with like $1,000. You can see how an extrovert is just more naturally motivated to take that risk. Okay, same situation, bigger, much bigger reward for an extrovert than an introvert. Now, does that mean that an introvert is doomed and doesn't get any reward for taking that risk? No. it means that introverts have to tap into another form of motivation in order to get themselves to take that risk. Okay, they have to think about what could be good about doing that presentation. Maybe they'll get exposure, to senior level executives, or maybe they're really passionate about the material that they're going to present. That's actually the motivation when I'm doing public speaking as an introvert. What I'm tapping into is I'm super motivated to share these ideas with people. That's what gets me on Facebook Lives. Is the idea that I'm tapping into this other form of motivation. Okay, so let me play this out with another example, because I think that this idea of being on a spectrum is so interesting, and understanding it gives us so much control. So I clipped this photo from my Title IX catalog, and Sarah wants to learn to surf. Okay, and naturally, we have a natural set point that is determined by our biology. Almost 50% of introversion and extroversion is encoded in our DNA. Okay, the other 50% is where we have control, and that's why I think coaching is powerful, is we're taking control of the part that we have control over. So this is her natural set point, okay? She's kind of below neutral, more on the introverted side. Now, when Sarah thinks about looking foolish, having to go to class alone, maybe having to wear a swimsuit in front of strangers, falling off, all of those thoughts are going to push her further and further and further. Okay, that cortisol that comes from thinking those scary thoughts increases her stress response and tells her brain that there is very little reward for taking this risky activity. And so it pushes her further down the scale. Okay, if you take that same situation and she thinks about how much she's always wanted to learn to surf, and how everyone falls, and how the instructor is literally getting paid to answer her questions, she's going to be able to go outside of her natural set point, her comfort zone, that's what people are talking about, and come further up the scale and walk into class by herself, or maybe grab a friend to go with her and ask all of her questions and learn to surf. Then when class is over, she can go right back down to her natural set point. Okay, we're not trying to get people to become extroverts. We're just talking about moving up and down the scale in order to meet your goals. Okay, so my challenge for today's Facebook Live is to ask you, especially if you identify as an introvert, to take some sort of social risk. And if you need some help coming up with that external motivation, for coming up with some thoughts that help you feel more comfortable in taking that risk, I encourage you to set up a free 20-minute call with me. I'm going to drop the link in the box, and you can just click that, and we'll hop on the phone for however much time you need, and get you moving so that your introversion doesn't become an excuse for not doing what you want to do this summer.